Rain cut through the Seattle night like glass shards, each drop a reminder that nowhere was safe. Not anymore. Zara Williams pressed her back against the brick wall of the alley, her breath coming in ragged gasps that formed clouds in the frigid air. The purple bruise spreading across her left cheek throbbed with each heartbeat, a testament to Marcus's parting gift before she'd finally found the courage to run. Her phone buzzed against her ribs where she'd hidden it in her bra. The same number. Again. She didn't need to look to know it was him, tracking her like a predator who'd caught her scent. The restraining order was just paper, worthless against a man who'd made threats his currency and fear his weapon. Where are you watching from tonight? She wondered, thinking of viewers who might understand what it meant to run with nothing but hope. Comment below and let me know where you're following this story from, because sometimes knowing others are listening makes the darkness feel less absolute. Marcus's voice echoed from the street beyond the alley. You can't hide forever, baby. I know this city better than you do. His tone carried that sickening sweetness he used before his fists reminded her who had control. Zara's hands trembled as she pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, the fabric soaked through and useless against the cold seeping into her bones. 3 blocks away, in a restaurant that never appeared on any public directory, Minjun Park sat motionless at a table carved from a single piece of black walnut. The private dining room smelled of sandalwood incense and expensive scotch, an atmosphere that spoke of power exercised quietly and absolutely. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, every line designed to convey control without ostentation. The 3 men seated across from him shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, unused to the silence that stretched between his words like a blade. The debt will be paid in full by Friday, Minjun stated, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. His fingers, long and precise, rested flat against the table's surface. No interest negotiations. No extensions. No exceptions. The middleman, sweating despite the room's careful climate control, cleared his throat. Mr. Park, you have to understand our position. The market conditions, the supply chain disruptions. Minjun's dark eyes shifted to him with the slow deliberation of a predator selecting prey. Understanding and accommodation are 2 different concepts. I understand perfectly. Your operations manager diverted funds intended for our arrangement into his personal accounts. Your failure to maintain oversight created this situation. My accommodation ended the moment trust was broken. Outside in the rain, Zara forced herself to move. Staying in one place too long meant capture, and capture meant returning to the apartment that had become her prison. Her sneakers squelched against the wet pavement as she emerged from the alley, scanning the street for any sign of Marcus's black sedan. The neon signs of Koreatown bled color across the wet asphalt, transforming puddles into small mirrors that reflected a world she'd never quite understood. Her stomach clenched with hunger she'd been ignoring for hours. The $23 in her pocket represented everything she had left after emptying her secret savings account. The one Marcus didn't know existed. Not enough for a hotel room. Barely enough for food. Definitely not enough for a bus ticket to somewhere he couldn't follow. The warm light spilling from a restaurant's frosted windows drew her attention. No English signage, just elegant Korean characters that curved like calligraphy across the glass. Through the window, she glimpsed empty tables and soft lighting that promised warmth, if only for a few minutes. Maybe she could buy a cup of tea, sit somewhere safe while she figured out her next move. In the restaurant's private room, Minjun continued his business with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. Your associate will transfer the full amount, plus the penalty fee for breach of contract, within 72 hours. His tone remained conversational, but something in his stillness suggested volcanic forces held in perfect check. One of the men leaned forward. And if we need more time, then you'll discover why punctuality is considered a virtue in our circles. Minjun's smile was winter itself, beautiful and merciless. The meeting is concluded. The front door of the restaurant burst open with a sound like breaking bones. Zara stumbled inside, her clothes streaming water onto the polished floor, her eyes wild with terror and desperation. Behind her, Marcus's voice cut through the night rain like a razor. There you are, you stupid bitch. Did you really think you could run from me? The three businessmen at Min Jun's table froze like deer caught in headlights. The maitre d' stepped forward with practiced calm. But Zara was already moving deeper into the restaurant, past the empty public dining area toward the private rooms in the back. She could feel Marcus behind her, his presence like a hand around her throat even though he hadn't touched her yet. Please, she gasped, pushing through the door to Min Jun's private dining room. Her voice broke on the word, 6 months of swallowed screams finally finding release. Please let me in. I have nowhere else to go. Time crystallized into a single moment of perfect tension. Min Jun's eyes met hers across the room, taking in her bruised face, her soaked clothes, the desperate courage that had brought her into his world. Behind her, Marcus filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his face twisted with the rage of a man who'd been denied his prey. What the hell is this? Marcus demanded, his voice carrying the entitled aggression of someone accustomed to getting his way through volume and intimidation. Zara, get your ass over here right now or I swear to God. His words died as Min Jun rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator uncoiling. The businessman across from him had gone completely still, recognizing something in Min Jun's movement that spoke to older, deeper instincts about survival and submission. I believe, Min Jun said quietly, his accent adding formal precision to each syllable, that the lady has made her position clear. Perhaps you should respect her wishes. Marcus took a step into the room, his chest puffed with the false courage of a man who'd never encountered real danger. Do you know who you're talking to? That's my girlfriend, and this is none of your business. Min Jun moved with casual efficiency, placing himself between Marcus and Zara with movements that seemed almost choreographed. The temperature in the room shifted, becoming charged with the promise of violence held perfectly in check. I am Min Jun Park, he said simply, as if his name should explain everything. And you are no longer welcome here. Recognition flickered across Marcus's face, followed immediately by fear. The name carried weight in certain circles, weight that settled over him like a physical force. His bluster deflated as survival instincts finally overcame his anger. This isn't over, he muttered, but he was already backing toward the door. Zara, this isn't over between us. Yes, Min Jun replied with absolute certainty, it is. Marcus left like smoke dispersing in wind, taking his threats and his entitlement with him into the night. The three businessmen followed quickly, understanding that their presence was no longer required or desired. In the sudden silence, Zara found herself alone with a man whose reputation preceded him like shadows before lightning. She stood dripping on his expensive carpet, shivering from cold and adrenaline and the awful relief of being, for the first time in months, truly safe. Min Jun studied her with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail, every bruise, every sign of the fear she'd been carrying like stones in her pockets. You are injured, he observed, his voice gentler than she'd expected. And wet. These things should be addressed. Zara nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She had stepped into his world seeking sanctuary, and something in his controlled stillness told her that sanctuary, once granted, would be absolute. What she didn't yet understand was that protection, in Min Jun Park's universe, came with a price that neither of them could have anticipated. The rain continued to fall against the windows, washing the city clean while inside, two lives collided with the inevitability of gravity itself. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building that scraped the Seattle sky like a silver needle. Min Jun's private elevator climbed soundlessly through the night, its mirrored walls reflecting Zara's bedraggled appearance back at her in infinite repetition. She stood in the corner, still dripping rainwater onto the polished floor, acutely aware of how her soaked clothes clung to her body and how her hair hung in wet tangles around her shoulders. Min Jun stood opposite her, his presence filling the small space with controlled energy. He had removed his suit jacket and draped it over his arm, revealing the precise lines of his white dress shirt and the way fabric moved across shoulders built for more than boardroom negotiations. His dark eyes studied her reflection in the mirrored walls, cataloging details with the systematic attention of someone accustomed to identifying threats and vulnerabilities. The elevator doors opened onto a foyer that spoke of wealth exercised with restraint. No ostentatious displays of power, just clean lines and expensive materials chosen for their quality rather than their ability to impress. Charcoal marble floors stretched toward floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city sprawling below like a circuit board of lights. "You will be safe here," Min-jun said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had never been wrong about such matters. "But safety requires parameters." Zara followed him deeper into the apartment, her sneakers squeaking against the polished stone with each step. The living space was vast and carefully curated. All leather furniture and dark wood that suggested masculine tastes, refined by generations of inherited sophistication. The scent of sandalwood lingered in the air, mixed with something else she couldn't identify, something that seemed to emanate from Min-jun himself. "Parameters," she repeated, testing the word. Her voice sounded small in the large space, but she forced herself to stand straighter despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. "What kind of parameters?" Min-jun moved to a sidebar where crystal decanters caught the city lights and fractured them into rainbow patterns across the wall. He poured amber liquid into a glass without asking if she wanted any, the simple action carrying implications about decision-making that made Zara's spine stiffen with automatic resistance. "Your former partner has connections that extend beyond simple domestic disputes." Min-jun's tone remained conversational, but something in his stillness suggested volcanic forces held in perfect check. "Marcus Chun works security for the Serpent Brotherhood. They are competitors in certain business sectors where I maintain interests." The name hit Zara like cold water. She had heard whispers about the Serpent Brotherhood, rumors that floated through the restaurant where she used to work before Marcus decided her job brought her into contact with too many other men. Drug runners, loan sharks, people who settled disagreements with violence that made the evening news. "You're saying he's not just an abusive boyfriend," she said, sinking onto the leather couch without invitation. Her legs had decided they were done supporting her weight. "You're saying he's actually dangerous." "I am saying that what was previously a personal matter has become a professional concern." Min-jun approached with the glass, offering it to her with a gesture that managed to be both courteous and commanding. "The Serpent Brotherhood will view your presence here as either leverage or provocation, depending on their current relationship with my organization." Zara accepted the glass, her fingers brushing his in the transfer. His hands were warm despite the coolness of his demeanor, and she noticed the calluses on his knuckles that spoke of activities not typically associated with business meetings. The scotch burned her throat, but the warmth spreading through her chest felt like the first genuine comfort she had experienced in months. "So what happens now?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly despite the intimidation factor of his focused attention. "Do you turn me over to them? Trade me back to Marcus for whatever business arrangement you value more?" Something shifted in Min-jun's expression, a flicker of what might have been surprise or perhaps approval. "No," he said simply. "You asked for sanctuary. I have given it. But sanctuary in my world comes with requirements that are non-negotiable." He moved to the windows, his reflection ghosted against the city lights beyond. "You will remain here under my protection until the situation with the Serpent Brotherhood is resolved. You will not leave this building without escort from my security team. You will not make contact with anyone from your previous life without my approval. These measures are for your safety, not your punishment." Zara set the glass down on the coffee table with more force than necessary, the crystal ringing against the marble surface like a bell. "So I trade one prison for another? Just with better furniture and higher thread count sheets?" Min-jun turned from the window, his dark eyes unreadable. "Is that what you believe this is? Prison? What else would you call it?" Zara stood, pacing to the windows where the city spread below like a map of possibilities she couldn't access. "You're telling me I can't leave, can't contact anyone, can't make decisions about my own life. How is that different from what Marcus was doing?" The silence stretched between them, filled with tension that felt almost electric. When Min-jun finally spoke, his voice carried undertones that made Zara's skin prickle with awareness of the danger he represented to others, if not to her. Marcus Chen used fear and violence to control you because he was weak and insecure. I am offering you protection from threats that could end your life because I am neither weak nor insecure. The difference should be apparent. Zara whirled to face him, her exhaustion transforming into the kind of angry energy that had finally given her the courage to run. Don't you dare lecture me about the difference between control and protection. I've heard that speech before, and it always ends the same way. Then perhaps, Minjun said, moving closer with steps that seemed carefully measured, you should observe the evidence rather than rely on past experience with inferior men. The phrase hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Zara's breath catch in her throat. She found herself studying his face, looking for signs of the casual cruelty she had learned to recognize in Marcus's expressions. Instead, she saw controlled intensity and something else, something that looked almost like respect for her willingness to challenge him. Fine, she said, crossing her arms over her chest. Let's talk evidence. What happens if I decide your protection isn't worth the price? What happens if I want to leave? Then you leave. Minjun's response came without hesitation. But you do so understanding that the Serpent Brotherhood will not simply forget you existed once you walked into my establishment. They will use you to send a message about territorial boundaries and respect. That message will be written in your blood. The bluntness of his words sent ice through Zara's veins. She had spent months focused on escaping Marcus's immediate threats, without considering the larger implications of his criminal connections. The restaurant job that had seemed like such good money now revealed itself as a window into a world she hadn't understood existed. How long? She asked, hating how small her voice sounded. How long until it's safe for me to have my life back? Minjun studied her with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything, calculate every angle. Until I eliminate the threat they represent, which could be days or weeks, depending on their willingness to negotiate a mutually beneficial resolution. And if they're not willing to negotiate, then I will resolve the situation through alternative methods. His tone remained conversational, but something in his stillness suggested capabilities that went far beyond boardroom discussions. The Serpent Brotherhood understands only strength. If necessary, I will speak their language. Zara moved back to the couch, her legs suddenly unsteady as the full implications of her situation settled over her like a weight. She had fled from one dangerous man only to place herself under the protection of another, one whose reputation suggested capabilities that made Marcus's threats look like playground bullying. You're hurt, Minjun observed, his voice gentler than she had heard it yet. When did you last eat? The question caught her off guard. She couldn't remember her last real meal, had been surviving on convenience store coffee and granola bars while she planned her escape. Yesterday? Maybe the day before? Everything blurs together when you're running. Minjun moved to an intercom panel near the kitchen, pressing a button with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Kim, please prepare soup and rice for two. Something simple and warming. His Korean flowed like water over stones, musical and precise. You don't have to take care of me, Zara said, though the promise of hot food made her stomach clench with desperate hunger. I'm not your responsibility. For the duration of your stay here, Minjun replied, returning to pour himself a glass of the same scotch. You are exactly my responsibility. That is what protection means in practice, not merely in theory. He approached the couch where she sat, close enough that she could detect the sandalwood scent that seemed to cling to his skin, mixed with something uniquely him that made her hyper-aware of his physical presence. Without warning, he reached toward her face, his movements slow and deliberate. Zara flinched, old reflexes activated by the approaching hand. Minjun stopped immediately, his fingers hovering inches from her bruised cheek, his expression shifting into something that looked almost like pain. I will not hurt you, he said quietly, but this needs attention before infection sets in. She forced herself to remain still as his fingers traced the air around her injuries, not quite touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. His examination was clinical yet gentle, the attention of someone who understood violence and its aftermath. Mrs. Kim will have supplies for proper cleaning and bandaging. For now, you should rest. Tomorrow we will discuss the practical arrangements for your stay here. Practical arrangements. The phrase made her situation sound temporary and manageable, like a business trip rather than protective custody. Zara found herself clinging to that interpretation, the possibility that this was a brief interruption in her life rather than a complete transformation. What kind of practical arrangements? Clothing, since yours are not suitable for extended wear. Communication protocols for emergencies. Introduction to my security team so they can recognize and protect you. Basic orientation to the building's layout and safety systems. The list made it real, made it clear that this was not a single night's shelter but an indefinite arrangement that would reshape every aspect of her existence. Zara felt the weight of it settling over her like a blanket, simultaneously comforting and suffocating. I don't want to be anyone's burden, she said, meeting his eyes with all the strength she could summon. If I'm going to be here, I want to contribute something. I have skills beyond needing rescue. Min Jun's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something that might have been approval flickering across his features. What skills? Accounting. Business administration. I was working toward my MBA before everything fell apart. I can handle books, manage schedules, organize systems. I don't want to be dead weight. Interesting. Min Jun settled into the chair across from her. His posture relaxed but alert, like a predator at rest who could explode into motion at a moment's notice. My organization has legitimate business interests that could benefit from additional administrative oversight. The possibility of being useful, of having purpose beyond simply existing under protection, sent relief through Zara's system like a drug. She had been drowning in helplessness for so long that the prospect of contributing something valuable felt like being thrown a lifeline. But first, Min Jun continued, his tone returning to that formal precision that seemed to be his default mode. You must heal. Both physically and psychologically. Safety is the foundation. Everything else builds from there. Mrs. Kim arrived with a tray that carried the most wonderful smells Zara had encountered in recent memory. The elderly Korean woman moved with efficient grace, setting bowls of steaming rice and soup on the coffee table while speaking to Min Jun in rapid, musical Korean. Her eyes on Zara were kind but assessing, the look of someone accustomed to evaluating people quickly and accurately. After Mrs. Kim departed, Min Jun gestured toward the food. Eat, rest. Tomorrow we begin the process of ensuring your safety becomes permanent rather than merely immediate. Zara lifted the spoon, her hands steadier than they had been in weeks. The soup was perfect, warming her from the inside out and reminding her that her body had needs beyond mere survival. As she ate, she studied Min Jun over the rim of her bowl, trying to understand the man who had transformed her desperate flight into something that felt almost like sanctuary. She was still trapped, she realized, still subject to someone else's rules and restrictions and decisions about her life. But this cage was lined with silk instead of barbed wire, and the man holding the keys looked at her with something that might eventually become respect rather than contempt. It wasn't freedom, but it was safety. And for now, safety was enough. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Min Jun's penthouse, transforming the city below into a watercolor painting of muted grays and blues. Zara woke in the guest room to the sound of quiet conversation drifting from the kitchen, Korean voices moving in rhythms that sounded like music, even when she couldn't understand the words. The bed had been the most comfortable thing she'd experienced in months. Memory foam and Egyptian cotton that felt like sleeping on clouds after Marcus's cheap mattress with its broken springs. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed the purple bruise on her cheek had deepened overnight, but the swelling around her eye had reduced enough that she could open it fully. Clean clothes waited on the dresser, expensive-looking items in her exact size that someone had acquired with impressive efficiency. The jeans fit perfectly, and the cashmere sweater felt like a gentle caress against skin that had become accustomed to cheap fabrics and rough treatment. Someone had been paying attention to details that Marcus had never bothered to notice. She found Min Jun in the kitchen, wearing charcoal slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms that spoke of physical conditioning beyond what business meetings required. He stood at the stove, moving with the precise efficiency of someone who approached cooking with the same systematic attention he brought to everything else. Mrs. Kim bustled around him, speaking rapid Korean while arranging items on a tray, with the practiced grace of someone who had been managing his domestic environment for years. When she spotted Zara in the doorway, her weathered face creased into a smile that transformed her entire expression from stern efficiency to grandmotherly warmth. "Good morning," Zara said tentatively, unsure of the protocol for entering what was clearly a well-established morning routine. Min-jun looked up from the pan where he was preparing what appeared to be traditional Korean breakfast items. "The clothes are suitable?" "Perfect," she replied, running her hands down the sweater's soft fabric. "Thank you. I'll pay you back for everything once I can access my accounts again." Mrs. Kim said something in Korean that sounded like gentle scolding, waving her hand dismissively at the mention of payment. Min-jun's mouth quirked slightly, the first expression approaching a smile that Zara had seen from him. "Mrs. Kim says that a guest in her kitchen does not speak of payment for basic necessities. She finds the concept insulting to proper hospitality." "Your kitchen?" Zara asked, looking around the space that clearly belonged to Min-jun's penthouse. "She has worked for my family since I was a child," Min-jun explained, transferring food from pan to plate with movements that spoke of years of practice. "In her view, I remain a boy who would starve without her supervision. This perspective extends to anyone under her care by extension." The easy affection between them was unexpected, revealing a side of Min-jun that contrasted sharply with the controlled businessman she had met the night before. Mrs. Kim moved around him with the familiarity of genuine family, occasionally swatting his hands away from items she deemed improperly handled. "Sit," Mrs. Kim commanded in accented English, gesturing toward the breakfast bar. "Too skinny. Need feeding." Zara found herself obeying automatically, settling onto a stool while Mrs. Kim assembled a plate that contained more food than she typically ate in 2 days. Rice, kimchi, soup that smelled like comfort itself, and several items she didn't recognize but that looked carefully prepared and artfully presented. "This is too much," Zara protested, but Mrs. Kim was already adding more items to the plate with the determined expression of someone who would not be deterred from her mission. "Do not attempt to argue with her about food portions," Min-jun advised, settling onto the stool beside her with his own plate. "I learned years ago that resistance only results in larger servings and wounded feelings." The food was a revelation. Zara had eaten Korean cuisine before, but never anything prepared with this level of skill and attention to detail. Each bite revealed layers of flavor that built on each other in complex harmonies, spicy and savory and comforting in ways that reminded her of her grandmother's cooking, though the specific flavors were entirely different. "This is incredible," she said, meaning it completely. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "Mrs. Kim taught me when I was young," Min-jun replied, his voice carrying subtle warmth when he spoke of the older woman. "She believed that a man who could not feed himself properly could not be trusted with larger responsibilities." Mrs. Kim nodded vigorously, launching into what appeared to be a detailed commentary about Min-jun's childhood, eating habits, and current deficiencies in self-care. Though Zara couldn't understand the specific words, the tone was universal. The exasperated affection of someone who had been worrying about this particular man for decades. "What is she saying?" Zara asked, fascinated by the interplay between them. "That I work too much, eat too little, and need a wife to manage my domestic affairs properly." Min-jun's tone remained neutral, but Zara caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested this was a frequent topic of conversation. Mrs. Kim gestured toward Zara while delivering what sounded like a pointed observation, her expression indicating clear approval of something she had noticed. Min-jun's response was sharp enough that Mrs. Kim raised her eyebrows and delivered what appeared to be a lecture about proper manners. "She likes you," Min-jun said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "She has expressed the opinion that you have intelligent eyes and good posture, which she considers indicators of character." The unexpected compliment made warmth spread through Zara's chest. After months of Marcus's constant criticism about her appearance, her intelligence, her worth as a person, Mrs. Kim's simple approval felt like water in a desert. "What did you say to her just now that earned you the lecture?" that her observations about my personal life were unnecessary and inappropriate to discuss in front of a guest. Min Jun's expression remained composed, but something in his stillness suggested embarrassment he was working to control. Mrs. Kim said something else, patting Zara's hand with affectionate approval before bustling away to clean the kitchen with the efficiency of a small tornado. When she was gone, the space felt larger and more intimate simultaneously, leaving Zara alone with Min Jun and the awareness that they were still essentially strangers navigating an impossible situation. "She seems wonderful," Zara said, meaning it. "How long has she been with your family?" 32 years. "She came to work for my father when I was 7 years old, after her husband died in an industrial accident." Min Jun's voice carried the kind of careful neutrality that suggested deeper emotions held under strict control. "Your parents? Dead. Car accident when I was 19. Mrs. Kim stayed to help me manage the household and the transition of business responsibilities. The expected arrangement became permanent by mutual agreement." The simple words carried weight that spoke of trauma and responsibility accepted too young, of a boy forced to become a man before he was ready. Zara found herself reassessing everything she thought she understood about the controlled businessman sitting beside her. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "Difficulty is a luxury of having choices," Min Jun replied. "Necessity eliminates the option of being overwhelmed by circumstances." The philosophy spoke of someone who had learned early that survival required the suppression of inconvenient emotions, that strength was measured by the ability to function regardless of personal cost. It reminded Zara uncomfortably of her own coping mechanisms, the way she had learned to normalize Marcus's behavior until abnormal became routine. "Is that how you see what happened to me?" she asked, testing the boundaries of their developing dynamic. Difficulty versus necessity? Min Jun studied her with those dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail, every micro-expression that might reveal her true thoughts. "What happened to you was the systematic destruction of your autonomy by a man who confused control with strength. What you did about it was necessity recognizing that survival required action." The distinction surprised her with its precision and understanding. Marcus had spent months convincing her that she was weak, that she needed his guidance and control because she couldn't be trusted to make good decisions. Min Jun's assessment positioned her flight not as weakness but as strength recognizing reality. "You don't think I was stupid for staying as long as I did? I think you survived a dangerous situation using the tools available to you until you could acquire better ones." Min Jun's tone carried no judgment, only the kind of analytical clarity that reduced complex situations to their essential components. The validation hit her unexpectedly hard. Zara had been carrying guilt and self-recrimination for months, questioning every decision that had led her deeper into Marcus's web of control. To have someone look at her situation and see strategy rather than stupidity felt like being given permission to stop punishing herself. "What about you?" she asked, wanting to understand the man who had offered her sanctuary without really knowing anything about her. "How did you end up in a position where helping random strangers is just another business decision?" Min Jun's pause stretched long enough that Zara wondered if she had overstepped some invisible boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful precision of someone revealing information that was rarely shared. "My family's business interests often put us in contact with people whose problems become our problems. The line between personal and professional obligations becomes blurred when your reputation depends on how you handle situations where others have failed." It was a diplomatic answer that revealed very little while explaining everything. Zara was beginning to understand that Min Jun's world operated according to rules that prioritized honor and obligation over simple profit calculations. He had helped her not because he owed her anything, but because his code required it. Their phones buzzed simultaneously, breaking the intimate atmosphere that had developed over breakfast. Min Jun checked his device with the efficiency of someone whose attention was always in demand, but his expression shifted into something harder as he read the message. "What is it?" Zara asked, though his reaction already told her the answer would not be good. "Marcus has made contact with my office. He claims you stole something belonging to him and demands a meeting to discuss terms for your return." Min Jun's voice had returned to the controlled neutrality she recognized from their first meeting. "I didn't steal anything," Zara said, though even as she spoke she was cataloging everything she had taken from the apartment. Clothes, personal documents, the cash from her secret account. "Your freedom is not his property to reclaim," Min Jun replied, his tone carrying implications that made the air in the room feel charged with potential violence. "But his willingness to make demands suggests he believes he has leverage we have not yet identified." "What kind of leverage?" "The kind that requires investigation before I can provide a complete answer." Min Jun stood, his breakfast abandoned as business priorities reasserted themselves. "You will remain here while I gather information about his connections and capabilities." "Wait," Zara said, rising as well. "I know Marcus better than anyone. If you're trying to figure out what he's planning, I can help." Min Jun paused, studying her with the same intensity he had brought to assessing threats the night before. "What could you tell me that would be useful for tactical planning?" Zara forced herself to think past the emotional associations that made discussing Marcus feel like willingly touching something toxic. "He's not as smart as he thinks he is, but he's good at finding people's weaknesses. He'll try to make you think this is about money or business, but it's really about control. He can't stand losing something he considers his property." "Property," Min Jun repeated, his voice carrying undertones that made Zara's skin prickle with awareness of the controlled danger he represented. "He won't stop until he gets me back or until someone makes stopping more attractive than continuing." Zara met his eyes directly, forcing herself to remain steady under his focused attention. "He's not rational about this. He's obsessed." "Obsession can be useful," Min Jun observed. "Obsessed men make predictable choices and create exploitable vulnerabilities." The clinical way he analyzed Marcus's psychology as a tactical advantage reminded Zara that she was under the protection of a man whose world operated according to rules that had little to do with conventional morality. It should have been frightening, but instead she felt relief at finally having someone on her side who understood that some problems could only be solved through strength. Mrs. Kim returned to clear the breakfast dishes, taking one look at their faces and immediately switching to rapid Korean that sounded like questions delivered with the authority of someone expecting immediate answers. Min Jun's responses were brief and respectful, but Zara caught enough of his tone to understand he was reassuring her about Zara's safety. "She worries," he explained after Mrs. Kim had extracted what appeared to be promises about proper precautions. "She has seen too many situations where good intentions were not sufficient to prevent bad outcomes." The reminder that their situation carried real dangers, not just inconvenience, settled over Zara like a weight. She was not simply a houseguest who would eventually return to her normal life. She was someone whose presence had introduced complications that could have consequences extending far beyond her personal safety. But as she watched Min Jun prepare for his day with the systematic efficiency of someone whose life required constant vigilance, she realized that for the first time in months, she felt like someone was actually fighting for her, rather than simply managing her as a problem to be solved. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was the first step toward reclaiming herself from the wreckage Marcus had made of her life. 3 days of careful coexistence had established rhythms that felt almost normal. Zara spent mornings reviewing financial documents that Min Jun brought from his legitimate business operations, her accounting background proving immediately useful in identifying discrepancies and inefficiencies that had been overlooked by his previous consultants. Her suggestions for restructuring cash flow management had impressed him enough that he'd begun including her in video conferences with his financial advisors. The work gave her purpose beyond simply existing under protection, and she attacked the numbers with the focused intensity of someone grateful to have problems that could be solved through intelligence rather than endured through survival. Min Jun's businesses were more complex than she had expected, spanning import operations, real estate development, and technology consulting with legitimate profits that dwarfed what she assumed his less legal activities generated. This afternoon found them in his home office, a space that managed to feel both professional and intimate with its combination of modern technology and traditional Korean artwork. Zara sat at the conference table with spreadsheets arranged around her like battle plans, while Min Jun worked at his desk fielding calls that moved seamlessly between Korean, English, and what sounded like Mandarin. She had learned to read his moods through subtle changes in posture and tone, the way his shoulders tensed when dealing with problems that required delicate handling, how his voice took on additional formality when someone was testing boundaries that should not be tested. Right now he was speaking to someone who clearly represented a significant irritation, his responses growing shorter and more precise with each exchange. "The numbers are wrong," Zara announced when he finished the call, looking up from the quarterly reports she had been analyzing. "Either your import division is hemorrhaging money through incompetence, or someone is skimming profits with considerable sophistication." Min Jun turned from his desk, his attention focusing on her with the intensity that always made her acutely aware of his physical presence. "Show me." She stood and moved to the wall-mounted display screen, connecting her tablet with movements that had become automatic over the past few days. The spreadsheet appeared in full color, revealing patterns that became obvious once properly organized and cross-referenced. "Look at these shipping costs versus reported inventory," she said, highlighting the relevant columns with quick gestures. "The numbers diverge consistently by 8 to 12% across all major shipments. But the variance isn't random. It follows specific patterns based on route and timing." Min Jun approached the screen, standing close enough that she could detect the sandalwood scent that seemed to cling to his skin, mixed with something uniquely him that made her hyper-aware of his proximity. His shoulder brushed hers as he leaned forward to examine the data, the contact sending electricity through her system that had nothing to do with the business discussion. "You believe this represents theft rather than inefficiency," he observed, his voice carrying the controlled interest he brought to problems that required solutions. "I believe someone has been very clever about disguising theft as standard cost fluctuation." Zara forced herself to focus on the numbers rather than the way his proximity was affecting her concentration. "The skimming pattern suggests someone with access to shipping schedules and pricing information, probably someone in your logistics management team." Min Jun was quiet for several moments, studying the data with the systematic attention he brought to everything that affected his operations. When he spoke, his voice carried implications that made the air in the room feel charged with potential consequences. "I will have this investigated immediately. The individual responsible will discover that stealing from my organization carries significant occupational hazards." The casual way he discussed what were clearly going to be serious repercussions for whoever had been stealing from him reminded Zara that she was under the protection of a man whose business methods extended well beyond conventional corporate responses to employee theft. It should have been frightening, but instead she felt a dark satisfaction that someone who solved problems through intelligence and strength was finally on her side. "What happens now?" she asked, returning to her seat at the conference table where the afternoon light streaming through the windows caught the subtle gold threads in the carpet. "Now you have proven that my initial assessment of your capabilities was conservative rather than optimistic." Min Jun settled into the chair beside her, closer than strictly necessary for continuing their business discussion. "Your insights have identified theft that my regular auditors failed to detect." The praise sent warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with professional validation and everything to do with the way his dark eyes seemed to see her as someone worthy of respect rather than merely protection. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her accomplishments with genuine admiration that she had forgotten how intoxicating that recognition could feel. "Does this mean I get to see more than just these four walls?" she asked, testing the boundaries of their arrangement with a directness that would have earned her punishment from Marcus but seemed to intrigue Min Jun. "You want to leave the apartment?" His tone carried curiosity rather than disapproval, but she noticed the subtle shift in his posture that suggested increased alertness. "I want to feel useful beyond analyzing spreadsheets in isolation." Zara met his gaze directly, refusing to back down despite the intensity of his focused attention. "If I'm going to be part of your business operations, I should understand how they function in the real world." Min Jun considered this with the careful deliberation he brought to decisions that carried consequences beyond the immediate moment. "Tonight, I have a dinner meeting with potential investors for a new development project. Your analytical skills could be valuable for assessing their financial projections." The prospect of leaving the penthouse, of participating in something that felt like normal professional life, sent excitement through Zara's system like electricity. but she forced herself to consider the implications beyond her own desire for activity and stimulation. "Is it safe?" she asked, though part of her was already imagining what it would feel like to dress professionally again, to be introduced as someone whose opinions mattered rather than someone who needed protection. "My security team will ensure appropriate precautions." Min Jun's voice carried the confidence of someone whose preparations were always thorough and whose backup plans had backup plans. "You will be introduced as my new financial consultant, which has the advantage of being essentially accurate." The dinner took place at an exclusive restaurant that existed somewhere between public accommodation and private club, the kind of establishment where reservations required connections rather than simply money. Zara wore a black dress that someone had acquired with the same mysterious efficiency that had produced her daily wardrobe, the fabric managing to be both elegant and appropriate for business while making her feel beautiful in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. Min Jun appeared in the living room as she was adjusting her jewelry, wearing a charcoal suit that emphasized the precise lines of his shoulders and the controlled power of his movements. When his eyes met hers, something shifted in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat. "You look," he began, then stopped as if reconsidering his words. "Professional. Appropriate for the evening's requirements." The careful neutrality of his response couldn't disguise what she had seen in that initial moment, the flash of something that looked like desire held under strict control. The awareness that he was attracted to her, that their carefully maintained professional boundaries might be as much about mutual protection as genuine indifference, sent heat through her system that had nothing to do with the restaurant's ambient temperature. The dinner proceeded with the smooth efficiency of a well-choreographed performance. The potential investors were exactly what Zara had expected. Wealthy men who spoke confidently about opportunities they understood superficially, while clearly expecting others to manage the actual details. Min Jun introduced her as his financial consultant, and she found herself fielding questions about cash flow projections and risk assessment with competence that surprised even her. But it was the way Min Jun watched the other men's reactions to her that created tension beneath the surface of professional courtesy. When one of the investors let his eyes linger too long on her décolletage, Min Jun's response was subtle but unmistakable, a shift in positioning that placed himself more clearly between them. When another made comments about her insights that carried undertones of surprise that a woman could understand complex financial concepts, Min Jun's voice took on the kind of formal precision that suggested barely controlled irritation. The possession implicit in his protective behavior should have annoyed her. Instead, she found herself hyper-aware of his proximity, the way his hand occasionally brushed her lower back when guiding her through conversations, the subtle territorial marking that had nothing to do with their professional relationship and everything to do with something deeper and more dangerous. "You handled that well," Min Jun observed as their car pulled away from the restaurant, the city lights blurring past the windows in streams of gold and red. "The investors were impressed with your analysis of their financial projections. They were impressed that I could add numbers without using my fingers," Zara replied, her tone carrying more edge than she had intended. "The surprise on their faces when I questioned their risk assessment was educational. You are bothered by their assumptions about your capabilities. I'm bothered by the way you felt the need to mark your territory every time they looked at me like I might be available for extracurricular activities." The words came out before she could stop them, carrying months of suppressed frustration about being treated like property rather than a person. The silence in the car's back seat became charged with tension that felt almost electric. Min Jun's expression shifted into something harder and more controlled, the careful businessman replaced by someone whose patience had limits that were not infinite. "You object to my ensuring that they understood your status as my employee rather than their entertainment? I object to being managed like property that might be damaged if not properly supervised." Zara turned to face him directly, her own frustration finally finding its voice. "You spent the entire evening positioning yourself between me and them like I couldn't be trusted to handle unwanted attention from middle-aged men with more money than sense. And how exactly would you have handled Peterson's suggestion that you join him for a private discussion of investment opportunities over drinks at his hotel?" Min Jun's voice carried the kind of controlled fury that made the air in the car feel dangerous. "The same way I handled every other inappropriate comment from men who think their bank accounts make them irresistible." with intelligence and professionalism and enough verbal precision to make it clear that their advances were neither wanted nor appropriate. You believe you can simply dismiss men like Peterson with clever conversation and professional boundaries? Min Jun's laugh held no humor whatsoever. You understand nothing about the world you have entered. Then explain it to me instead of treating me like a child who can't be trusted to understand adult conversations. Zara's voice rose despite her efforts to maintain control. I've been managing inappropriate advances from men since I was 14 years old. I don't need a bodyguard to handle dinner conversation. Peterson is not some corporate middle manager whose worst offense is uncomfortable small talk. Min Jun's tone had shifted into something that made Zara acutely aware of the controlled violence he was capable of deploying. He owns politicians, judges, police officials. Men who cross him disappear. Women who reject him are often found weeks later in conditions that make identification difficult. The bluntness of his words sent ice through Zara's veins, but also sparked anger that she couldn't suppress. Then why did you bring me into the same room as him? If he's so dangerous, why expose me to that risk just so I could feel useful for a few hours? Because I believed my presence would be sufficient protection, and because your skills were valuable enough to justify the carefully calculated risk. Min Jun's voice carried frustration that matched her own. What I did not anticipate was your reaction to reasonable precautions. Reasonable precautions or possessive behavior. The question hung in the air between them like a weapon neither of them had intended to deploy. Min Jun's expression shifted again, something vulnerable flickering across his features before being suppressed by will and long practice. Perhaps both. I am not accustomed to situations where the distinction matters. What does that mean? It means that 5 years ago, I allowed personal feelings to compromise my professional judgment. A woman I thought I could protect was used as leverage against me because I failed to anticipate that my enemies would recognize my attachment before I recognized it myself. Min Jun's voice carried the kind of careful control that suggested deeper pain held under strict management. What happened to her? She died because I confused protection with partnership and failed to understand that some threats require preemptive elimination rather than defensive positioning. Min Jun met Zara's eyes directly, his expression carrying the weight of guilt that had been carried too long. I will not make that mistake again. The confession explained everything about his behavior, the careful distance he maintained despite obvious attraction, the way he treated her safety as a tactical problem rather than an emotional concern. He had loved someone once, and that love had gotten her killed because he had underestimated the ruthlessness of people who recognized weakness and exploited it without hesitation. I'm not her, Zara said quietly, though she understood that in his world, the distinction might not matter. I'm not asking you to compromise your judgment or your professional priorities. I'm asking you to trust that I can be strong enough to deserve the protection you're offering. Strength is not always sufficient, Min Jun replied, but something in his voice had shifted away from controlled fury toward something that sounded almost like pain. Sometimes it simply means you fight longer before you lose. The car pulled into the underground garage of his building, the concrete walls closing around them like a concrete embrace. In the artificial light, Min Jun's face looked stark and beautiful and haunted by ghosts that would never entirely leave him alone. They rode the elevator to the penthouse in silence, charged with everything they hadn't said. Everything they couldn't afford to acknowledge without changing the fundamental dynamics of their arrangement. When the doors opened onto his foyer, Zara paused before stepping out. For what it's worth, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think she was lucky to have someone love her enough to try that hard to keep her safe, even if it wasn't enough in the end. Min Jun's response was too quiet to catch, but something in his expression suggested that her words had hit harder than either of them had expected. As she walked toward her room, she felt the weight of understanding settling between them like a bridge neither of them had intended to build. She was falling for a man whose last attempt at love had ended in tragedy, and he was struggling with feelings that his experience told him were too dangerous to indulge. The collision between safety and desire was becoming impossible to ignore, and somewhere in the city Marcus was planning something that would force them to confront what they meant to each other before either of them was ready. Tomorrow would bring new complications, But tonight she lay in bed listening to Min-jun moving around the penthouse and knowing that protection and possession were becoming impossible to distinguish because both of them wanted something that felt too dangerous to name. The morning started like any other, with Mrs. Kim bustling around the kitchen while Min-jun conducted business calls in 3 languages and Zara reviewed financial projections that required her increasingly valuable insights. 7 days of careful routine had created an illusion of safety that none of them questioned until it was too late to matter. Zara had been feeling restless, confined by walls that were beautiful but still walls nonetheless. When Mrs. Kim mentioned needing to pick up specialty ingredients from the Korean market in the international district, Zara saw an opportunity to feel useful beyond spreadsheet analysis. "I could go with her," she suggested to Min-jun as he finished a call with his logistics team about the theft investigation that was yielding increasingly disturbing results. "Help carry things, translate if needed. I'm going stir-crazy sitting here analyzing numbers all day." Min-jun's response was immediate and non-negotiable. "No. Mrs. Kim has been shopping independently for 32 years. Your presence would create unnecessary complications. I'm not talking about wandering around the city alone." Zara forced herself to keep her voice level despite the frustration that had been building for days. "I'm talking about a 90-minute shopping trip with your housekeeper to a market 6 blocks away. Your security team could follow us if you're worried about threats." "The threats are real and immediate," Min-jun replied, his attention already shifting back to the documents spread across his desk. "Marcus has made contact with known associates of the Serpent Brotherhood. Intelligence suggests they are planning something that requires your location to remain unknown. So I'm supposed to stay locked in this apartment forever?" The question came out sharper than Zara intended, carrying months of suppressed claustrophobia and the growing awareness that safety and imprisonment could feel remarkably similar. "You are supposed to trust that my assessment of risk factors is more comprehensive than your desire for normal activities." Min-jun's voice carried the kind of controlled patience that suggested his own limits were being tested. Mrs. Kim intervened with rapid Korean that sounded like gentle scolding directed at both of them. Her tone suggested the universal exasperation of someone who had watched too many stubborn people argue about obvious solutions. She concluded by patting Zara's hand and speaking directly to her in careful English. "Shopping alone better. Too much attention together. You stay safe here." The dismissal stung more than Zara expected, the reminder that her presence created complications for everyone around her. She nodded and retreated to her room, but the feeling of being a burden rather than a partner continued to gnaw at her as the morning progressed. It was Mrs. Kim herself who provided the opportunity, though she never intended it as such. Around noon, she received a phone call that sent her into rapid preparations for departure, gathering keys and shopping bags while speaking Korean that sounded increasingly urgent. "Family emergency," she explained to Zara in passing. "Sister's grandson in hospital. Must go immediately." She was gone within minutes, leaving Zara alone in the penthouse while Min-jun conducted a video conference with what appeared to be a team of investigators. Through the closed office door, she could hear his voice alternating between English and Korean as he coordinated responses to whatever the theft investigation had uncovered. The silence in the apartment felt oppressive after weeks of Mrs. Kim's bustling presence. Zara found herself pacing between rooms, studying the art on the walls and the carefully curated books on the shelves, looking for clues about the man who had become the center of her universe despite her determination to maintain emotional distance. She almost missed the sound of the service elevator opening in the kitchen hallway, a subtle mechanical hum that barely registered over the ambient noise of the building's systems. Almost missed the whispered conversation in English that suggested people who were trying not to be overheard. The realization hit her like cold water. Mrs. Kim had used the main elevator. She always used the main elevator. The service entrance was for deliveries and maintenance, not for people who belonged in the building. Zara moved toward Min-jun's office with careful steps that made no sound on the polished floors. Through the crack under his door, she could see his shadow moving as he gestured during his conference call, completely focused on business that had nothing to do with immediate physical threats. The kitchen hallway was empty when she peered around the corner, But the service entrance door stood slightly ajar in a way that violated every security protocol Minjun had explained during her first day in the apartment. The wrongness of it made her skin prickle with awareness that something terrible was about to happen. She should have called for Minjun immediately. Should have triggered whatever alarm system protected the apartment. Should have trusted that his security measures would handle threats more effectively than her untrained assessment of danger. Instead, she moved closer to the service door, trying to determine if the intruders were already inside the apartment or still planning their approach. The decision cost her the precious seconds that might have made the difference between escape and capture. The hand that closed over her mouth moved with professional efficiency, cutting off her scream before it could form, while an arm around her waist lifted her off her feet with practiced ease. The cloth pressed against her nose and mouth smelled of chemicals that made her vision blur, and her struggles weakened despite every instinct screaming at her to fight. Her last clear thought before consciousness slipped away was that Minjun had been right about the risks she was too naive to understand, and that her desire for independence might have cost both of them everything that had begun to matter. When Zara woke, concrete walls and fluorescent lighting told her she was no longer in the penthouse. Her hands were zip-tied behind her back, and her mouth was covered with duct tape that made breathing difficult. The warehouse around her smelled of rust and motor oil, with windows too high to see through and exits that were undoubtedly guarded by people who had no interest in her continued well-being. Marcus sat in a folding chair 10 feet away, looking pleased with himself in a way that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. Behind him stood 2 men she didn't recognize, both carrying weapons with the casual confidence of people who used them regularly. "There's my girl," Marcus said, his voice carrying the possessive satisfaction that had once made her feel special and now made her skin crawl. "I was starting to think your Korean boyfriend had hidden you away permanently." The tape across her mouth prevented response, but her eyes must have communicated enough fury to satisfy him. His smile widened with the cruel pleasure of someone who had regained control over something he considered his property. "Oh, you're angry? That's adorable." Marcus leaned forward, close enough that she could smell the cologne he wore to cover the scent of violence that seemed to cling to him like smoke. "You think you can just walk away from me? Start a new life with some foreign criminal who thinks his money makes him untouchable?" One of the armed men approached Marcus with deference that suggested hierarchy and discipline. "The phone calls have been made. Park's people know we have her, and they know our terms." "What terms?" Zara wondered, though the tape prevented her from asking. What could Marcus possibly want that would justify this level of risk and elaborate planning? Marcus stood and began pacing around her chair with the restless energy of someone who had been planning this moment for weeks. "See, baby, your new protector made a serious mistake when he decided to interfere in our relationship. He cost the Brotherhood a significant amount of money and respect when he made them back down from our original arrangement." The words confirmed her worst fears about the connections between Marcus's abuse and larger criminal organizations that operated according to rules she didn't understand. She had thought she was escaping one dangerous man, but instead had stepped into a war between competing predators who viewed her as leverage rather than a person. "So now we're going to make everything right," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when explaining why his violence was actually her fault. "Park is going to transfer a substantial sum to demonstrate his apology for the disrespect. The Brotherhood gets their compensation, I get my girlfriend back, and everyone learns important lessons about territorial boundaries." Through the warehouse windows, Zara could see afternoon light fading toward evening. Minjun would have discovered her absence by now, would be mobilizing whatever resources he used to solve problems that threatened his interests. The question was whether he viewed her as important enough to risk his organization's safety, or whether practical considerations would force him to write her off as an acceptable loss. The answer came sooner than any of them expected. The warehouse lights went out simultaneously, plunging the space into darkness that felt absolute after hours of fluorescent glare. Emergency lighting kicked in seconds later, casting everything in harsh red shadows that transformed familiar shapes into menacing silhouettes. "What the hell?" Marcus snapped, his voice carrying the first notes of uncertainty since Zara had regained consciousness. The armed men moved with trained efficiency, weapons raised and attention focused on entrances that suddenly seemed inadequate for proper defensive positioning. But their preparation proved irrelevant when the attack came from directions they had not anticipated. Windows that had seemed too high to access exploded inward in synchronized destruction, safety glass falling like deadly rain while figures in dark tactical gear repelled into the warehouse with movements that spoke of military precision. The red emergency lighting turned the scene into something from a nightmare, all moving shadows and controlled violence that seemed choreographed for maximum psychological impact. Min Jun appeared through the smoke and chaos like a force of nature given human form. Gone was the controlled businessman who had shared breakfast conversations and financial consultations. This version moved with lethal grace, his weapon an extension of his body, as he eliminated threats with surgical precision that left no doubt about the outcome. The two guards fell within seconds, their own weapons useless against coordinated assault that had planned for every possible response. Marcus tried to use Zara as a shield, pressing a knife against her throat while screaming demands that were lost in the systematic destruction of his leverage and his illusions about power. Min Jun's approach was inexorable, each step calculated to increase psychological pressure, while minimizing risk to the woman he had come to retrieve. When he spoke, his voice carried implications that made the warehouse feel smaller and more confined despite its industrial dimensions. Release her now and you die quickly. Continue holding that knife, and you discover why my reputation extends beyond simple business disagreements. Marcus's hand shook against Zara's throat, the blade drawing a thin line of blood that served only to focus Min Jun's attention with laser intensity. You kill me, and the Brotherhood never stops hunting both of you. They know who you are, where you live, everyone you care about. The Brotherhood ceased to be a concern approximately 20 minutes ago. Min Jun replied with the casual certainty of someone who had eliminated problems at their source. Their leadership structure no longer exists in any meaningful form. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, and Zara could feel his certainty crumbling as he realized that his elaborate plan had been anticipated and countered by someone whose resources and capabilities he had fundamentally misunderstood. "You're lying," Marcus said, but his voice carried doubt that undermined his attempt at confident negotiation. "Test that theory," Min Jun suggested, continuing his approach with movements that seemed unhurried but somehow covered distance faster than should have been possible. "See how long your allies take to respond to calls for assistance." Marcus's attempt to use his phone confirmed what Min Jun's confidence had already suggested. No answer from numbers that should have been continuously monitored. No response from people who had promised backup and resources in exchange for delivering Zara as promised. In the moment of distraction, Zara threw herself sideways off the chair, accepting the pain of hitting concrete in exchange for removing herself from Marcus's reach. The knife clattered across the warehouse floor as Min Jun moved with speed that made his previous restraint seem almost casual. What followed was not a fight so much as an execution delayed only by Min Jun's desire to ensure Marcus understood the scope of his miscalculation before paying the final price for threatening something that belonged under Min Jun's protection. When it was over, silence returned to the warehouse like water filling empty space. Min Jun knelt beside Zara with hands that were steady despite what he had just done, cutting the zip ties and removing the tape with gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence he had just deployed. "You are safe," he said quietly, his voice carrying emotion he was struggling to control. "I am sorry I failed to prevent this." Zara found herself shaking not from fear but from relief so profound it felt like drowning in reverse. The taste of freedom mixed with the metallic scent of violence and the sandalwood cologne that meant safety in ways she was only beginning to understand. "You came for me," she whispered, though saying it felt like stating the obvious. "Did you believe I would not?" Min Jun's question carried genuine confusion, as if her doubt about his response revealed a failure in communication that needed immediate correction. "I hoped," she admitted, studying his face in the red emergency lighting. "But hoping and knowing are different things." "Then know this," Min Jun said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "No force exists that could prevent me from coming for you. No threat, no distance, no consideration of personal cost or professional consequence. You belong under my protection now, and that protection is not negotiable or temporary." The declaration should have frightened her with its implications of possession and control. Instead, it felt like the first completely honest thing anyone had said to her in years. She was his to protect, but she was beginning to understand that he was equally hers to hold accountable for the promises his protection represented. As his security team secured the warehouse and prepared for departure, Zara realized that something fundamental had changed between them. The crisis had forced them both past careful boundaries and professional distance into territory that had nothing to do with business arrangements and everything to do with emotions that neither of them could continue to deny. Marcus was dead, the external threat eliminated with the kind of permanent finality that Min Jun's world demanded. But the internal threat, the growing connection between them that made protection impossible to separate from possession, remained as dangerous and inevitable as gravity itself. The war was over. The real challenge was just beginning. The penthouse felt different when they returned, no longer a beautiful prison but a sanctuary chosen rather than imposed. Min Jun had been silent during the drive from the warehouse, his attention focused on ensuring her physical comfort while his security team handled the aftermath with efficient discretion. Now, in the familiar space where they had learned to navigate the dangerous territory between protection and partnership, the careful distance they had maintained seemed impossible to sustain. Zara sat on the leather couch where she had first tasted his scotch and tried to understand the terms of her captivity, but her hands shook too much to hold the cup of tea that Mrs. Kim pressed into her palms. The elderly woman had returned from her family emergency to find organized chaos, police tape, and a security briefing that left her alternately scolding and fussing over both of them in rapid Korean. "You need medical attention," Min Jun said, settling beside her with careful movements that suggested he was struggling with his own aftermath of violence. "The knife cut requires proper cleaning and bandaging." "It's just a scratch," Zara protested, though the thin line across her throat burned with each word. "I've had worse injuries from kitchen accidents." Min Jun's expression shifted into something that looked almost like pain. "You should never have been at risk for any injury. My protection failed when you needed it most." The self-recrimination in his voice made her heart ache for him. She set down the teacup and turned to face him fully, noting the controlled tension in his shoulders and the way his hands rested on his thighs as if he were forcing himself not to reach for her. "Your protection didn't fail," she said quietly, meaning every word. "You came for me. You eliminated the threat. You brought me home safely. That's not failure, that's exactly what protection is supposed to look like." "I should have anticipated that they would use Mrs. Kim's emergency as an opportunity to access the apartment." Min Jun's voice carried the weight of professional disappointment in tactical oversight. "Should have realized that Marcus would coordinate with more sophisticated operators than his previous behavior suggested." "You can't control every variable in the universe," Zara replied, remembering similar conversations where she had blamed herself for Marcus's escalating violence. "Sometimes bad things happen despite good planning. What matters is how you respond when they do." Mrs. Kim approached with a medical kit that suggested she had dealt with similar injuries before, her movements efficient and gentle as she cleaned the knife cut and applied butterfly bandages with practiced ease. Her commentary in Korean sounded like a mixture of relief and lecture, directed equally at both of them. "She says we were both foolish," Min Jun translated, his mouth quirking slightly at Mrs. Kim's blunt assessment. "You for taking unnecessary risks, me for allowing the situation to develop in ways that created those risks." "What else does she say? That emotional complications make people careless, and careless people create problems that require dramatic solutions." Min Jun's tone remained neutral, but Zara caught the subtle tension around his eyes that suggested Mrs. Kim's observations hit closer to home than he was comfortable acknowledging. Is she wrong? The question hung between them like a bridge neither had intended to build. Min Jun was quiet for several moments, his dark eyes studying her face with the intensity he brought to problems that required careful consideration of all possible consequences. "No," he said finally, "she is not wrong. My feelings for you compromised my judgment in ways that created vulnerabilities. Professional distance might have prevented today's situation entirely." The admission sent both relief and fear through Zara's system. Relief that he had finally acknowledged what had been building between them for weeks. fear that his acknowledgement meant he was preparing to reestablish the boundaries that would keep them safe from emotional complications. "So what happens now?" she asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze despite the intensity of his focused attention. "Do you send me away to eliminate the vulnerability I represent?" Min-Jun reached for her hands, his fingers warm and steady as they closed around hers. The contact sent electricity through her system that had nothing to do with the trauma of the afternoon and everything to do with the feelings they had been denying since her first night in his protection. "I dissolve the protection contract," he said quietly. "Remove all restrictions on your movements and decisions. Give you complete freedom to choose your future without obligations or pressures related to your safety." The words should have felt like liberation. Instead, they felt like loss, the withdrawal of something she had come to depend on in ways that went far beyond physical security. She studied his face, looking for clues about what choice he hoped she would make. "And if I choose to stay, then you stay because you want to, not because circumstances force the decision." Min-Jun's voice carried careful neutrality that couldn't disguise the hope underneath. "You stay as my partner in every sense that matters, with full agency over your role in my life and my business operations." "Partnership," she repeated, testing the word. "Not protection. Not employment. Not some arrangement that lets you maintain control while calling it something prettier. Partnership that acknowledges your intelligence, your strength, your value as someone whose opinions and decisions matter as much as mine." Min-Jun's thumb traced across her knuckles with gentle precision. "Partnership that builds something together rather than simply managing threats and obligations." The honesty in his voice made her breath catch. After months of Marcus's manipulation and control disguised as love, the concept of genuine partnership felt almost too good to be real. But the man sitting beside her had risked everything to retrieve her from danger, had eliminated threats without asking for anything in return except the opportunity to keep her safe. "I love you," she said simply, because the truth could no longer be contained by fears about complications and vulnerabilities. "I love your intelligence and your strength and your ridiculous determination to protect people who matter to you. I love that you see me as someone capable of partnership rather than someone who needs to be managed." Min-Jun's response was immediate and devastating in its completeness. "I love you beyond the scope of rational consideration. You have become necessary to my existence in ways that transcend professional obligations or personal preferences. Losing you today was not acceptable. Losing you ever is not acceptable." The declaration should have frightened her with its intensity and implications. Instead, it felt like recognition of something that had been true since the night she had crashed into his restaurant seeking sanctuary and found something infinitely more valuable than simple safety. He kissed her then, finally crossing the boundaries they had maintained through weeks of careful distance and professional courtesy. His mouth against hers was warm and demanding and gentle simultaneously, carrying months of suppressed desire and the desperate relief of surviving something that could have destroyed them both. When they broke apart, Mrs. Kim was standing in the kitchen doorway with an expression of satisfaction that suggested she had been waiting for this development with considerable impatience. Her commentary in Korean sounded like approval mixed with the expectation that they would now handle their domestic arrangements with more efficiency and less dramatic complications. "What is she saying now?" Zara asked, though Mrs. Kim's tone suggested universal approval of recent developments. That "it is about time we stopped pretending professional distance" was more important than obvious emotional attachment. Min-Jun's voice carried amusement and resignation in equal measure. Also that she expects a proper engagement announcement within reasonable time frame. "Engagement," Zara repeated, her heart rate accelerating for reasons that had nothing to do with residual trauma from the afternoon's violence. Min-Jun stood and moved to the window where city lights were beginning to appear against the evening sky. When he turned back to face her, his expression carried the kind of controlled vulnerability that suggested he was about to risk something that mattered more than tactical advantages or business considerations. "Marry me," he said simply, "not because obligation or protection requires it, but because partnership means building a future together that acknowledges what we have become to each other." The proposal hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that would reshape every aspect of her existence. Marriage to Min-Jun meant fully entering his world, accepting the dangers and responsibilities that came with loving someone whose business required constant vigilance and occasional violence. It also meant never again being alone with threats she couldn't handle, never again questioning whether someone powerful enough to protect her would choose to do so, never again wondering whether she was valued for her intelligence and strength or simply managed as a complicated responsibility. Yes, she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Yes, because I love you and trust you and want to build something together that neither of us could create alone. Min Jun's relief was visible, tension leaving his shoulders as he returned to the couch and pulled her into his arms with movements that conveyed both passion and the desperate gratitude of someone who had risked everything and won more than he had dared to hope. Mrs. Kim reappeared with champagne that suggested she had been preparing for this outcome despite their determined attempts to maintain professional distance. Her toast in Korean required no translation, the universal language of someone celebrating the triumph of sense over stubbornness. For those of you following this story from wherever you are in the world, Zara thought as she lifted her glass, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust someone enough to let them protect you completely. And sometimes that trust becomes the foundation for something more beautiful and powerful than either of you imagined possible. They spent the evening making plans that had nothing to do with security protocols and everything to do with building a life that honored both their backgrounds and their shared future. Min Jun wanted to incorporate Korean traditions into their wedding ceremony while ensuring that Zara's African-American heritage was equally represented and celebrated. The conversation revealed depths of cultural curiosity and respect that had been developing beneath their careful professional interactions. He asked thoughtful questions about her family traditions, her grandmother's recipes, the music and customs that had shaped her understanding of love and commitment. She found herself learning about Korean concepts of honor and obligation that gave context to his protective instincts and business ethics. By the time they said goodnight, the protection contract had been formally dissolved and replaced by engagement planning that felt infinitely more complex and vastly more satisfying. Zara fell asleep in her own room, but with the door open and the understanding that territorial boundaries were now matters of preference rather than necessity. 3 months later, she stood in the penthouse living room wearing a dress that incorporated both Korean silk and African patterns, surrounded by people who had become family through choice rather than obligation. Mrs. Kim bustled around with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose matchmaking instincts had been vindicated, while Min Jun's business associates mingled with Zara's friends in conversations that bridged languages and cultures with surprising ease. The ceremony itself was brief but profound, vows spoken in both English and Korean that promised partnership in all things, protection freely given and freely accepted, love that had survived danger and emerged stronger for having been tested. When Min Jun slipped the platinum ring onto her finger, it felt like completion rather than captivity, the symbol of choice rather than obligation. He had kept his promise to eliminate threats and provide safety. She had kept her promise to be strong enough to deserve partnership rather than simply management. Together they had built something that honored both their needs and their capabilities, a relationship founded on mutual respect that had deepened into love that felt as permanent as the city skyline stretching beyond their windows. As their guests departed and the evening settled into domestic tranquility, Zara found herself back on the leather couch where she had first tasted his scotch and tried to understand the terms of an arrangement that had transformed into something infinitely more valuable than simple protection. "Any regrets?" Min Jun asked, settling beside her with movements that carried the relaxed confidence of someone whose primary concerns had been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. "Only that it took a kidnapping to get us to admit what was obvious to everyone else," Zara replied. Accepting the glass of champagne he offered with hands that were steady with certainty rather than shaking with fear. "Mrs. Kim says emotional complications make people unnecessarily stubborn," he observed, his voice carrying amusement and the kind of contentment that came from having all essential problems successfully resolved. "Mrs. Kim is a very wise woman," Zara agreed, studying the ring that caught the city lights and reflected them back in facets that seemed to multiply the illumination rather than simply redirecting it. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker beyond the windows like stars that had decided to take up residence on Earth. The penthouse no longer felt like a refuge from danger, but like home chosen and built together, a sanctuary that existed not because threats required it, but because love had made it necessary. The cage had indeed become a chosen sanctuary, but more than that, it had become the foundation for partnership that acknowledged strength in vulnerability and found safety not in isolation but in the decision to trust completely and be trusted in return. Outside, the city continued its nightly rhythm of ambition and possibility. Inside, two people who had collided through crisis had discovered that the most dangerous thing you can do is let someone protect you so completely that protection transforms into love too powerful to survive without. And in that transformation, both the protector and the protected had found something infinitely more valuable than safety. They had found home.